Good morning. I'm excited to continue our sermon series going verse by verse through the Gospel of Luke. So if you haven't already, please take a minute and pause this video and read out loud Luke chapter 19, verses 11 through 27. That's what we're going to cover today. All right. So I'm excited this morning to get into this parable. It is, of course, the parable that falls immediately after Jesus' interaction with Zacchaeus. And it's at the conclusion of his interaction with Zacchaeus that Jesus tells us that he has come to seek and to save the lost. And it's important for us to remember that. It is one of the mission statements of our Lord. It's something that he has given us as a way of understanding his purpose and his interaction in the world. Why was Jesus incarnate? He came in the flesh to save. He came in the flesh to seek out and save his people who were lost. And so, having given that mission statement and crystallized that thesis for his disciples, we then move into this parable, the passage for today, verses 11 through 27. And we begin this morning with the question, are you faithfully stewarding the gospel entrusted to you? Are you found faithful? At the end of your day, are you living for your master's work? Are you committed? Do you care? Are you passionate for the things of God, for the expression of his kingdom in your life, in your heart, in your community, in your household? Are you faithfully stewarding the gospel? Now, a couple of technical things we've got to get to at the start of our study of this parable. And the first is, this is not the same parable that is found in Matthew chapter 25. That parable is often referred to by theologians and Bible teachers as the parable of the talents. The parable of the talents. This today is the parable of the 10 minas. Now, they appear at face value or at initial inspection to be very similar, maybe even interchangeable, but they're not. Today's parable focuses not on giftedness, which is where we get our modern definition of the word talent. Somebody who is talented in a particular area or thing is speaking to their giftedness, something innate in how they were made, innate to their personality, innate to their physical ability, innate to their artistic mind, whatever that might be. Today, we're going to be looking at the parable of the 10 minas, which is not about giftedness, it's about faithfulness. And that distinction will play a significant role in our study going forward. So, today's parable is about faithfulness, not giftedness. And as we are introduced to this parable, we will see three different sets of characters. There's the nobleman, there's the 10 servants, and there are the citizens who are rebellious. I might refer to them at the very end of this passage as the enemies of God, but for now, we'll understand them as the noblemen, the 10 servants, and the rebellious citizens. Now, for the sake of brevity and concision, I'm going to tell you up front that the nobleman represents Jesus, that the 10 servants represent in this story the followers of Christ, the disciples of Christ. And the rebellious citizens, of course, represent the enemies of God. The enemies of God in Israel in Jesus' day, the enemies of God alive and active in the world today around us as well. So, we see this in the opening in verse 11. We read, "As they heard these things, Jesus proceeded to tell a parable. because he was near to Jerusalem, and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. So at this point, people have big messianic aspirations for Jesus. His followers and even his enemies see him as someone who could take the mantle of being the Messiah, the long promised Christ who was to come. And so Jesus is nearing the hour of his crucifixion. He's nearing the physical proximity now of coming close to Jerusalem, which of course would be the city of David, the place where Jesus would be crucified just outside the city. So verse 11 is very transitory. It's Luke explaining to us in a pre-explanation of what motivates the telling of this parable. It's an authorial interpretation. So the people have seen Jesus' graciousness to Zacchaeus. They've heard his mission statement that he has come to seek and to save the lost, and they are being prepared to tie those thoughts to the parable that's coming. So Jesus speaks this parable to them because they assume that he is immediately going to rise to physical or better said, probably political power. So there are many people who are followers of Christ who want that. And there are the enemies of Christ who don't want that. They want to do everything in their power, political or otherwise, to stop this from happening. And that's why Jesus tells this parable. Because there's going to be a long delay. They think that the inheritance of his kingdom is going to happen immediately. And it's not. I think for some Christians today, the long delay between his first coming and his second coming is a huge concern. It's something that causes an unsettled feeling in their hearts, because Jesus seems to imply constantly that he's imminently returning and ushering in his kingdom. But of course, this parable is one of the places we can point to say, no, Jesus actually promised this delay. He promised us that there would be this interim period between his first coming, where he's dealing with sin, and his return, where his kingdom will be consummated. His kingdom's inaugurated at Pentecost, and it's consummated here at the end of all days, the beginning of eternity, at his return, the day of judgment. The Bible has lots of different ways to talk about this reality of Jesus coming back to judge the living and the dead in view of his appearing in his kingdom. Paul talks about this in the last letter that we have, the second letter we have from Paul to Timothy. But here's the deal. Jesus is teaching them about this delay, and he's teaching them about how they should live during that delay. And so that's where this parable comes from. So let's dive into the parable. Verse 12, Jesus said, therefore, quote, a nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then return. This, of course, is how kingdoms were established in their contemporary day. So you can see this throughout Jewish history. You can see this throughout the time period that surrounds the Roman Empire. You would travel to Rome and meet with Caesar, and Caesar would settle the claim to determine who would be king of that area, what the extent of his kingdom was, what the power he had as king was, Often there'd be financial implications of expectations for the treasury and the giving and the taxes and all that kind of stuff had to be worked out. But you would travel from your land, wherever it was, to see Caesar himself, and then Caesar would settle the disputes, because oftentimes there were multiple claims. So a nephew or a son or an uncle would say, no, I'm the rightful king of insert province or area or kingdom. And so this happened in the span of Jesus's lifetime. There was a situation where there was a guy who was king after Herod, and they had to settle the dispute of claims and establish who was, in fact, the new king in Israel. So there's a precedent that would be familiar in the mind of the audience as Jesus tells this parable. So this idea of a nobleman having to leave his home country to go to a faraway country to receive a kingdom for himself and then return with the power and authority that he was expected to have would not be new to them. That wouldn't sound weird to them. It sounds kind of weird to us because we sort of feel like if you're king over your land, like, you don't need a foreign power to tell you you're the king. You're the king. But in their day, Caesar as emperor governed even the kings. And so this would make a lot of sense to a Hebrew listener. Let's keep going. In verse 13, this nobleman, before he leaves, one more thing. In 12, the nobleman would go to the far country. He'd receive for himself his kingdom. He'd be recognized as king, and then he would return to rule. And so there is this promise of return, which establishes the foundation for this long departure, where the king goes and gets and then returns. That's the establishment of that interim period I mentioned earlier. Verse 13, calling 10 of his servants together, he gave them 10 minas and said to them, engage in business until I come. Notice, this soon-to-be king gives a direct command, and it's a command he expects to be followed and obeyed. No questions asked, no exceptions given. He calls these particular 10 servants in and gives them the same amount of money. This is one of the things that distinguishes this parable from the one in Matthew 25. They all get the same amount. They get a mina. Now, mina is 3 months' wages, approximately. And so it's not an insignificant amount of money, but it's also not a super intense, huge amount of money. So each of these servants receives the same amount. Each of the 10 receive 1 mina. And so they're charged with being faithful to their master's task. He calls them together, he gives them a mina, and he tells them this: engage in business until I come. The implied is come back, because he's heading out on this journey to go receive his kingdom. So here's the parallel for us as believers today. As people who live in the interim period between Jesus' first coming and his return, we are to be about our master's business until he returns. And we've all been given the same money. Again, this is a parable, right? So there are metaphors at play here. What's the money? The money's the gospel. You and I have been given the same gospel. How many times does Paul teach us that? How many times does the Bible have to tell us that we have the same promise that was given to Abraham? That we are sons of the same faith? That we have the same Holy Spirit throughout the ages? The Spirit that saves Moses and Abraham saves Paul, saves Peter, saves John, saves you and me. One Spirit, one faith, one baptism. This is the language of Ephesians 4. one gospel. There's one set of good news, and all others Paul refers to as non-gospels. They're not good news, they're bad news. There's one message of grace and hope for the whole world. And if we are in Christ, then we've been entrusted with that message. Some of us may understand that message in lesser or greater depth, experience, study, sure. But we all have been given the same gospel. And so if we're going to understand this parable as we go through it, we have to understand that this is what it means to be engaged in his business until he returns. He just told us what his business was: to seek and to save the lost. And so I ask you this morning, are you actively stewarding the gospel in such a way that you are seeking the lost that would be saved? In other words, are you putting the gospel to work? Are you investing your time, your talent, your treasure in the things of God, the expansion of God's kingdom, the preaching and teaching, the sharing and serving of the gospel? That's our master's task. And so the mina isn't a ton of money, but it's certainly enough money to test the servants in faithfulness, to see if they are faithful stewards investing the Lord's money in the Lord's work, the Lord's business. The mina represents the gospel. And there's an implicit promise that he's going to return in the preparation that this is only for an interim time period. So we continue in verse 14. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, "We do not want this man to reign over us." So apparently the nobleman is loved and served by some and hated by others. And there we have all three characters on the stage. We have the nobleman, we have the servants, and we have these rebellious citizens who are seeking to get a different claim of kingship authorized by Caesar from far away. That's how we see this come to pass. We do not want this man to reign over us. In other words, they don't want him to be king. So he will be king, and we'll see that there's severe results, repercussions for their rebellion. But for now, we just understand that there are citizens who are his enemies, seeking to make sure that he is not their king. The parallel to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the scribes and lawyers who have already determined that they want to kill Jesus as Jesus is drawing near to Jerusalem, certainly becomes an obvious parallel here. So we continue, verse 15. When the king returns, or better said, when the nobleman returned, now as king, having received the kingdom, that's what it means, he ordered the 10 servants, these servants, to whom he had given the money, to be called to him, that he might know what they had gained by doing business. In other words, he's asking each servant to give an account for how they invested and what returns they received on the money that he had entrusted to them. In other words, he's going to examine them for their faithfulness in his absence. How did they put his money to work? That's the question. How did they put his money to work? In other words, what kind of profit did their investments produce? This is exactly what Paul promises will happen to every one of us. We can see this in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 10. I'll read it. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. In other words, all of us will one day give an account for how we stewarded the things of God. I hope that's a little bit sobering to you this morning. I hope it's not a terror to you unless you don't know Christ. If you are not yet a follower of Christ, then this should be a strong warning to you. But if you're a follower of Christ, we know that Christ has paid the penalty for our failures. He's taken on the punishment for the guilt we have in rebelling against him. As we see now, we're talking about reaping rewards, not settling of punishment. So that's what's happening here in verse 15. So the master returns, he's now king, and he's asking for an account. So, verse 16, we continue. The first came to him and said, Lord, your mina has made 10 minas more. Now that's an astounding return on investment. That's a 1,000% return on investment. That's crazy astronomical large. I mean, nowadays, if you could produce a 20% return, people would be selling their things to give you more money so that you could bring a 20% return to them. That would be astronomical. 1,000% return is crazy successful. But notice his language. The language here is very clear. Lord, your mina made. The man takes no credit at all. He doesn't say, I made, or my investments made. How many of us would begin with us? But this servant doesn't do that. It's almost as if he believes that the mina has made the investment on its own. That the return is a product of the mina itself, not his own stewardship or faithfulness. That's an incredible response. But this rate of return shouldn't surprise us. If we really take serious what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, we read this. We read, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and then the Gentile. So the gospel does produce its own fruitfulness in the hands of faithful stewards. So there's an interesting interplay here in how Jesus presents the parable as a whole. The first servant is given a tenfold return on his investments, but he takes no credit. He takes no credit at all. We should learn a lot from that. We've been entrusted with the gospel, and we should put the gospel to work. And when we put the gospel to work, it accomplishes the purpose for which God has sent it forth. To reference Isaiah 55, of course. So, the response from the first servant is, your mina did this. And the master's response, the king's response, is found in verse 17. So he replies, well done, good servant. It's interesting that the master gives credit where the servant doesn't take credit. The master says, well done, good servant, because you have been faithful in a very little, you shall have authority over 10 cities. So, tenfold return on investment, governance and authority over 10 cities. What's also interesting to us is that he who is faithful with little is given more. That's an initial assessment for us, and we'll see that that has a principle that's interacting a little bit later on. But for now, that's the parable. That's the passage. That the reward is that because you are faithful with little, you'll be given more. And then we see this pattern upheld in verses 18 and 19 in perfect parallel. The only thing that's different is that the fruitfulness is halved. But listen to the language. The second servant came saying, Lord, your mina has made 5 minas. Notice he uses the exact same pattern of speech. Doesn't take any credit, but does note the distinguishing element is that the 1 mina that he was given made 5 minas. That's a 500% return. That's incredible. In fact, it would be incredibly astounding to the listener, except that the first servant did double what he did. Or, better said, he was faithful and the mina produced 500% return. So the master says to him, and you are to be over 5 cities. So again, the parallel here is about a proportional reward. You were faithful, this is the result, then you are going to be given these responsibilities proportional to the return on investment. And then we get a third servant. We're not going to do this with all 10. There's a brevity here that comes in this third servant. Verse 20, then another came saying, Lord, here is your mina. So again, all 3 servants examined after the king's return are saying the same thing. It's your mina. I don't own it. It's yours. I was entrusted with it. I steward it. But unlike the first 2, this one doesn't make an investment. That's an incredibly awful reply. He disobeyed his master's command. Watch. The other came, says, Lord, here's your mina, which I kept laid away in a handkerchief. In other words, he wrapped it up and he buried it. He stuck it under his proverbial mattress and did nothing with it. I can imagine the gasps that would be passing through the crowd as Jesus told this parable. Because this servant rebels against the clear instruction of his master. See, here's this in action. He deliberately disobeys the master's clear command from verse 13. So what could possibly excuse this behavior? Why wouldn't he have even tried just a little? Why bury the volume of money in such a way that he doesn't engage in the responsibility that he was given? Well, verse 21, we're given the answer in this parable. Jesus says, for I was afraid of you because you are a severe man. You take what you did not deposit and you reap what you did not sow. That's an incredible blame shift. It's a very succinct way of saying that the reason I'm afraid of you is your fault. It's your fault. I was so scared of you that I didn't want to lose any of the money that you had given me. So I just buried it and protected it and forgot about it. But that's not what he was commanded to do. He was not commanded to be afraid. He was commanded to steward, to go about his master's business and try. But he was so afraid of failure that he didn't even try. Now, it'd be really easy to condemn this servant if we weren't ourselves so apathetic to outreach and evangelism. It'd be easy to condemn this guy if we weren't so aware of the amount of times we've shirked our responsibility to share the gospel with classmates, with friends, with coworkers, with family, with those in our neighborhoods, those we inconveniently bump into. This guy has made no effort to go about his master's business. And he blames it on the master. King, it's your fault, I'm afraid. This is not going to go well. If you're paying attention, this is not going to go well. So the master has a reply. And we've got to go through this very carefully. Verse 22 and verse 23. We have to go through this with careful inspection, because there's a hypothetical element to what's happening in the king's reply. He's saying, in essence, for the sake of argument, let's assume that you're correct. For the sake of argument, let's assume that I'm as harsh as you're accusing me of. Shouldn't you have at least given my money to someone who knows what to do with it? Like a bank, right? This is what he says. Verse 22, the king says to the servant, I will condemn you with your own words. And then he calls him a wicked servant. We'll come back to that in a sec. You knew that I was a severe man, taking what I did not deposit, reaping what I did not sow. So he's saying, all right, let's say you're right, and this is true of me. And you had good cause to be afraid. Why then did you not put my money in the bank? And at my coming, I might have collected it with interest, even if it was a 2% return or a 3% return, 5% return. Not this 500% or 1,000% return that the first two servants got. But shouldn't you have given it to someone who would at least know how to use it if you were unwilling to use it yourself? Fascinating line of thought here. Ultimately, the wicked servant is condemned by his own words because his actions don't match his rationale. If he was really afraid instead of apathetic, this is what he would have done. He would have given it to a bank so that when the master returns, he could have gotten at least some interest on the master's money. In other words, the master is pointing out that the servant's behavior is out of sync with his theology. He's not living according to what he's thinking, what he's believing. If he was truly afraid of the master because the master is harsh, shouldn't that fear have motivated him all the more? So there's a sense in which the master in this parable is calling the bluff of the servant. He's basically saying, you're not really afraid at all. Your own words condemn you. You're not living up to this. So I have a quote from Philip Ryken. Dr. Ryken says this. He says, the word wicked may sound severe. I think it does. But that is how Jesus described him. Really, what else would you call a servant who refused to obey his master's command? What would you call a servant who slandered his master's good name and was so scared of making a mistake that he failed to do what he was supposed to do? According to Jesus, it is wickedness not to use what we have to serve our God. That's Dr. Ryken's quote there. How do we respond to this? Well, let's continue to watch and see what unfolds. So after being rebuked for not even giving it to a bank, the master says this, verse 24. So he said to those who stood by, this is proverbially or most likely the other servants, not yet examined, and he says, take the mina from him and give it to the one who has 10 minas. Seems reasonable if you know anything about business. Investing with those who know how to invest well, smart idea, right? But the other audience, the servants in this story, cry out, this is not fair. Why would you take from the one who only has one and give it to the one who had the 1,000% return? And of course, this is not mean. It's simply good business. It's very good business. And remember, the master's business is to seek and to save the lost. But here's the principle. So verse 25, the crowd hears this command of take it from him and give it to the one who produced 10 minas. And they say to him, Lord, he has 10 minas. Why does he need an 11th mina? Why do you give him one more? He doesn't need one more. Why would you do this? And here's the principle that Jesus teaches. Verse 26 is his reply to their objection that this is not fair. Verse 26, Jesus, in this parable, the master says, I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. Sounds harsh. It doesn't sit right with many of us today. But here's what's happening. If you take away the language of have and have not, because we often equate that to wealth and poverty, and instead put the words in faithful and unfaithful, then it really does make sense. So when Jesus is teaching here, he's saying that those who are faithful get more. More what? They're given more responsibility. Notice that the reward is not luxury, but authority and responsibility. Those who are faithful with little will be given more so that they can invest well on more higher stakes things. You invest well with this tiny little bit of money, how will you steward the cities of his kingdom? So the escalation of reward is proportional to faithfulness, not wealth. Faithful in very little is exactly what he says is the justification in verse 17. Go back, check out verse 17. Jesus says to him, well done, good servant. Because you have been faithful in a very little, you shall have authority over 10 cities. He's not on holiday, he's put to work. But he's put to work as governor over 10 cities. Because the mina he put to work reaped a reward of tenfold return, 1,000% return. All right, so there's this relationship happening to faithfulness as the justification for why he's given the reward he's given. So too, in verse 26, the other half works. But from the one who has not, in other words, from the one who has no return on investment, the unfaithful servant, the wicked servant. We take what he has, it's taken away. I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. From everyone who has not, even what he has will be taken away. It's not a statement of poverty. It's a statement of unfaithfulness. So that's the principle that's at play here. In other words, we trust the most responsibilities to those who have proven themselves to be faithful stewards. You get it? God entrusts more significant things at times as a general rule. Again, this isn't an absolute promise. It's a general promise. This is generally true. That God entrusts the most responsibilities to those who have proven themselves to be faithful servants. In other words, if you invest your money with those who have proven that they know how to use it, your money is well cared for. If you invest your business with those who have proven that they know how to faithfully run that business, then your faithfulness is a sign of excellence. It's a manifestation of that. And many of us would love this parable to end right now, as I'm sure there are some of you who want this sermon to end right now. We've got one more point to deal with, and then we'll conclude. Here's where we are. We have to deal with the rebellious citizens. Remember, we've only dealt with the nobleman turned king and with the 10 servants. So we have to look at this final set of characters in the story. Verse 27. But as for these enemies of mine, wow. He describes them as enemies of his, who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. The linguistic key for us is in the relationship between reign over them, which we see here in verse 27, and reign over us, which we see in verse 14. So verse 12 introduces the nobleman, 13 introduces the servants, and 14 introduces the rebellious citizens of the kingdom. So reign over us versus reign over them, we see in the conclusion of 27. So what happens to them? The king orders that they be brought to him and executed before him. As hard as that is for us to grasp, and it is hard, it's important that we understand two things. One, rebellion always ends in destruction. Rebellion against God always ends in destruction. And two, getting slaughtered in this manner is way better than all of the biblical depictions of hell. Getting slaughtered at the end of this parable is a way better depiction, a way better end result than what we see promised and portrayed in the biblical stories and explanations of what hell will be like in eternity for those excluded from the household of faith. Rebellion always ends in destruction, always, because God is just, and no one receives injustice from God. I'm not saying this is the cheeriest thought of your morning, but here's what we're saying. We're saying that as Jesus is teaching us about what it means to live between his first coming and his return, that interim period, he's teaching us to be faithful in the long delay, in that long gap of time between first and second coming. He's teaching us the importance of being about our master's business. And he's also warning both us and the rebel against him that this will end in their destruction. So trust the gospel to reap the fruitful rewards of the gospel, or be found an enemy of God and reap that reward, which is destruction, eternal separation from all benevolence of God, separated in a place called hell, almost always described as a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, a place of eternal torment, real and lasting suffering. I don't say this lightly, I say this very soberly, but there's a very real sense that those who will be in hell will wish that they could be slaughtered and that it would be over. Their suffering would be over. But for those of us in Christ, those of us with faith in Jesus, we do not receive that punishment. Instead, we receive the reward of the gospel, the great treasure of the gospel. So let's conclude a couple of things. First, God always gets credit for spiritual growth, right? God always gets the credit for spiritual growth. The gospel at work produces its own return. It is by God's grace that he's determined to use human agency at all. God could snap his fingers, he could speak, and bring all of the elect home himself. But instead, he chooses to use us in the proclamation of his word to draw others to himself. That's an incredible privilege. But God always gets the credit for gospel fruit. We are but humble servants. Second concluding thought, that one day Jesus will return and he will examine and reward us for the ways we stewarded his gospel during this interim time between first and second coming, before his triumphant return. And third is a question I want you to take seriously this week. Are you faithfully serving Christ in every area of your life? Are you faithfully serving Christ in every area of your life? Thank you for listening, and enjoy the continuation of our worship in song.